Hello, I'm Victoria Pearce from Endangered Heritage, and it's obvious that the safety of our heritage depends on the safety of its people, and particularly of staff and volunteers who look after the heritage. Now, I know that every single person here at this conference and all of the presenters will be talking about the safety of people and the risks that are around our heritage assets when there's been a disaster, whether they're engineering, whether they're hazards in terms of environmental hazards and personal safety hazards. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about some of the myths and some of the things that people can plan for, can get better quality advice for before an event, and really think about as part of their disaster plan to make sure that their staff and volunteers are safe. So, like I said, there's been lots of talk about, power lines and undermining of roads and flare-ups and animals and things. The one thing on this slide that I really want to stress is contaminated water. After the Ash Wednesday fires, there was definitely an awful lot of rainwater tanks that had animals climb in to get away from the fire and then died inside the tank. There wasn't a lot of water around. My advice, whether it's flood or fire, that you have absolutely planned how it is people are going to be able to clean up and how they're going to be able to have safe drinking water for themselves and for washing. I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not going to pretend to be, but I do want to deliver some of the best advice that I can find at the moment about some of the hazards and risks that may put your volunteers at risk, and something we need to think about in our duty of care for our staff and for our volunteers. So tetanus is often believed to be just associated with metal, and it's not true. Tetanus is an anaerobic bacteria that flourishes in a low oxygen environment, which of course is what corroding metal is. But soil and flood silt is also a low oxygen environment. And that means that any puncture marks or injuries when moving that kind of material, it can actually deliver tetanus. All volunteers should be vaccinated with tetanus because tetanus is such an awful disease that the first sign that you have it is lockjaw, and by then it's very, very difficult to treat with not very good success rates. Tetanus vaccines when I was a girl used to be believed to last for about 10 years. Now it's 3 to 5 years. And I think we've all got groovy with the idea of different variants after the global pandemic of COVID. So even if you've had a tetanus vaccine, it's probably a really good idea to keep a staff and volunteer register to make sure that someone's keeping an eye on them being up to date. Let's face it, if you run a collection anywhere, chances are 50% of those things spent time in a shed. So when they get wet or damaged in a disaster, it's going to activate an awful lot of bacteria and viruses that are on those things. There are other viruses and other risks in terms of waterborne hazards. Japanese encephalitis reared its head in Sydney and after the Lismore fires, and you can get vaccinated for that. Leptospirosis is passed from rats and mice in fecal matter that dissolves in floodwaters and causes inflammation and very terrible infections that can lead to death. Hopefully everyone's close to a medical facility and it won't happen, but you can get vaccinations for that, and so can animals for your pets. Salmonella and E. coli are really common in floodwaters, and it's really important that you have a protocol in place for all of your staff and volunteers to know that you take your gloves off, you wash your hands, you wash your face, you remove all of those airborne bacteria and things that are on you before you drink and eat. Folliculitis is one we don't talk about here, but after living in Manila, whenever there was a typhoon or flood, it was a serious issue. So folliculitis is an inflammation of the hair follicles from constant bombardment of the skin to infections and contaminants. So that inflammation can become quite dangerous because Your skin is your barrier to all of the other problems and hazards in the world. So if your skin starts becoming vulnerable, then all of you becomes vulnerable. If you have any itchiness, swelling, redness, inflammation in any parts of your body after walking through floodwaters, then you need to get medical attention straight away. Snakes are a really big issue, huge issue in Australia, but after fire or flood, the snakes tend to find their ways into roof rafters and all sorts of high places. So make sure people look up and make sure that your disaster kit is prepared for snake bites. After the flood, here in Canberra, there was an awful lot of spider activity. All of the creepy crawlies came out of their holes and started to climb for somewhere else to go. A lot of funnel webs after the floods here. So snakes aren't the only thing that's poisonous and hazardous. Your first aid kit needs to be prepped for that. The one that we probably don't talk about nearly enough is mental health and trauma counselling for responders. Where will they get the support when they're busy supporting the community assets such as our heritage? It doesn't take much to actually plan ahead. Make sure that there are going to be professionals and resources. Make sure that you've got information, business cards, some kind of plan for referral. The chances of everyone responding after a flood or a disaster and not being exhausted, emotional, overwrought, potentially having already saved their own house, had someone else they care about lose their house. In a whole community disaster, mental health and trauma is absolutely the number one issue that we have a bit of a duty of care, especially if we're going to extend people to be working on community assets. And I think that we could do an awful lot more to plan around that as part of our disaster planning. As I said, look up, think about snakes and wild animals and where they are going to be hiding as waters have flooded through, or even after fire, they're all looking for shelter. Set up sanitation stations around your work area so that staff know where they can go and volunteers know where they can go to the toilet, and that there's a place that they can clean their hands and ensure that they actually manage to maintain good personal hygiene while eating and drinking and doing the work that they're being asked to do. Most sites and most heritage sites that have experienced a disaster will have a staff room or an eating area or fridges and rubbish bins that may have food waste, may have pantries and other things that have foods in them. Don't just jump these things outside in a pile waiting for the garbage to be collected. If you can, bury them, get rid of them, or put them in a sealed container so that you are not attracting wild animals or other hazards in search of food. Make sure that you've got a plan for how you're going to make sure that your disaster doesn't become a secondary or third disaster with snakes and other things coming in to find what you've left lying around. Mold is particularly dangerous if you're very, very stressed with low immune, if you're a system, whether you're elderly, and if you've got compromised lungs from previous instances of COVID or pneumonia. Please remember that not all molds are equal. In fact, mold in cheese is quite lovely. So some molds are fine and not as high risk, but the ones we want to be really careful for are the molds on protein substrates. Molds designed to break down protein like leather, wool, and silk are the molds that break down us. They're the ones that you need to make sure people are wearing masks and that you've got a plan for how to go forward. This is a topic that probably deserves a presentation on its own, and if you need more information, it's an area of personal interest and research. I'd be happy to answer questions offline. In terms of mold practices, the responses listed in red are all very, very damaging, ineffective, and give a false sense of security to mold and its risks. They do an awful lot of damage to collections. Insurers tend to use vinegar and splash it around on everything. So we have a task of informing them that their first response needs to actually change with our heritage. And most of these methods are not safe at all. I don't know where people got the idea that because we use freezing for insects, freezing can also deal with mold. Obviously, if that were true, we could just put moldy food in the freezer and then eat it again. Crazy stuff. Anyway, one of the things that I think is a very simple solution is mold doesn't grow with good airflow. A punka fan, which is just a sheet over a broomstick and some rope that everyone tugs on and keeps the air flowing in our work areas inside a building that may be damaged, is going to help buy you time to get other jobs done so that there is no mold sprouting, even if you've got no power. So plan for some extra sheets and a couple of broom handles and rope. And how are you going to deal with keeping the air circulating if the power's off? 70-30 alcohol is very effective at killing mold and its spores. But remember, it's very dangerous on things like varnishes and painted surfaces, and you need to be really, really careful not to spray it around too far. The other thing is that, aerosol alcohol probably means that you don't want to be driving. There are lots of things that need to go into our disaster kits that people think they've got enough of, but rarely do. Scissors, blades, bandages, first aid kits. I like to have things sealed with a plastic welder, so they literally are sealed, not just a Ziploc or double Ziploc bag. It's not enough. Hoses, drinking water. There's a huge amount of things that can be put into a shed or somewhere away from the heritage, but be accessible and already planned for. I think everyone learned that when there were shortages after Lismore trying to find dehumidifiers, that if they'd already had a few on site in a high place, they wouldn't have had to be scrounging around looking for them. Remember that conservation businesses like myself often have a large supply of these sorts of disaster response equipment, which we're willing to lease or rent out. And again, I just want to mention WD-40, while not the high art of conservation response for metal, it can stop flash rusting and help minimize tetanus risks. So while you're planning now, have a talk to your team. Make sure that they have got medical clearance. If you've got working for vulnerable people requirements in your state, make sure you know what they are. Most volunteers now over 60 have to provide a fit for work statement from their GP annually. They need to be fully vaccinated, and you need to provide them with steel caps, gloves, and a plan. There needs to be mustering points, evacuation plans, and a backup plan for the backup plan for the backup plan. We have a duty of care to our volunteers. They're looking after us. We need to look after them. And don't forget, all disaster comes with a degree of fatigue, exhaustion, vulnerability, and trauma. I don't think it's too early to start planning for that as well. Thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying the conference.